No more Mr. Cautious. Rishi Sunak sacks Suella Braverman and rolls the dice by popping a peerage for the former Prime Minister David Cameron and making him Foreign Secretary. What's Rishi Sunak's big electoral idea? He's replaced Suella Braverman with James Cleverly. He's made the cabinet posher and rejected women for the top jobs. So how will this appear to the Red Road? The former minister and leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, is here to tell us why he thinks the Prime Minister has made a big mistake. And the Tory MP Richard Graham, who faced a barrage from colleagues in a Tory WhatsApp chat when he criticised Suella Braverman, tells us why the cabinet's better off without her. The only person Rishi Sunak wants to be Foreign Secretary when he has 350 MPs to choose from. So where is all this heading? We'll be joined by the former Tory Minister Ed Vaizey, the FT's Whitehall editor Lucy Fisher, and from the Daily Express, senior political correspondent Christian Calgi. Also tonight, 6 months after Newsnight reported from the Ukrainian town of Avdiivka near the front line of Donetsk, we bring you exclusive scenes from inside the town as it fends off Russian encirclement. But for how long can it do that?
This is my hometown. I was born in Avdiivka. Every day I go there, I see fresh destruction. It's painful. The house of my parents, where I grew up, is completely destroyed.
Good evening. Has Rishi Sunak finally got the cabinet he would have wanted to take him into the general election? Last year, he rewarded Suella Braverman for backing him for the leadership. But after events of recent weeks, this morning, he threw her out. That, of course, could have been her plan all along. Now she may well step back and regroup, ready to re-emerge after the election. Braverman's departure, and also that of Therese Coffey, left Rishi Sunak exposed on his right flank. But his new front bench includes Esther McVey as Cabinet Office Minister, unofficially equipped the political editor of The Sun, the Common Sense Minister, to tackle woke across Whitehall. So is the signal about tone or political direction? The same 5 pledges, but less of the muscular language. It's certainly posher at the top of the cabinet. The first time in more than 50 years that the top 4 jobs are all held by former public schoolboys. And the first since 2010 without a woman in any of the top 5 cabinet posts. Also, at least some of the 350 Conservative MPs could perhaps be forgiven for thinking, didn't David Cameron have his day in the sun? And of course, he was embroiled in the subsequent scandal over Greensill. Well, we'll come to the newly elevated Lord Cameron's appointment as Foreign Secretary in a few minutes. But first, Nick's here. Nick, this surely must have been the best kept secret in British politics.
Well, Kirsty, a tiny number of people knew about this, and yes, they kept quiet about it. The Daily Telegraph is reporting tonight that Rishi Sunak and David Cameron met last Tuesday to discuss this move, and I was speaking to a former member of the cabinet who knows both of them very well, and this person told me that yes, indeed, they did meet last week. What I was also told was it was William Hague who played the role of Cupid. Now, William Hague knows and admires Rishi Sunak very well because, of course, Rishi Sunak succeeded him as Conservative MP for Richmond in North Yorkshire. William Hague, great admiration for David Cameron. They had a very good rapport when William Hague was his Foreign Secretary. So what you have today is a young Prime Minister turning to an experienced hand to give gravitas to that cabinet in the run-up to a general election, which is exactly what David Cameron did in the run-up to the 2010 election when he called upon Ken Clarke, when he, David Cameron, was seen inexperienced. So quite a bold move on a very dramatic day. An ex-Prime Minister is summoned back years after an electoral defeat to the Foreign Office. Half a century later, and this defeated ex-Prime Minister answers the same call. A surprise appointment which takes David Cameron to a job he'd always coveted and places him back in the spotlight after 7 years in the wilderness. Failure over Brexit ended his premiership.
Say that's why we need another 5 years.
But success a year before, a surprise majority in 2015 after unseating a series of Lib Dems. a formula Rishi Sunak is eyeing. Right here in Downing Street, Rishi Sunak executed a pretty sharp turnaround. By handing one of the great offices of state to David Cameron, he effectively ripped up the post-Brexit consensus for where the Conservative Party should position itself. All that focus on the Brexit voters, all that focus on the red wall and those ex-Labour voters who rallied to Boris Johnson's Get Brexit Done message. Well, this reshuffle has been defined by the guy who took a different view on that and by the former Prime Minister who seems to symbolise centre-ground conservatism. A big political message, but how consistent is it?
Politics doesn't work the way it should. We've had 30 years of a political system which incentivises the easy decision, not the right one.
Just a month ago, Rishi Sunak trashed as failures his predecessors from all parties over the last 30 years. And he took the axe to one of David Cameron's signal projects, HS2. And now a call to the colours. So what would this collection of whips say about the return of David Cameron? A masterstroke or a desperate move?
Well, I think it's a very positive move. But as you well know, Nick, in the Whip's office, we support the government.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that it's just a month ago that the Prime Minister's conference speech was 30 years of political failure, and he's now called in the guy who was responsible for a fifth of those 30 years of failure. But you're enthused by this. I mean, lots of your MP colleagues from all wings of the party seem to be welcoming the David Cameron appointment.
Absolutely.
A minister who resigned today despite retaining the full confidence of the Prime Minister welcomed the appointment.
Very, very positive news.
Do you think it's a clever ploy, or does it look like it's a bit of a desperate last throw of the dice?
He's a man of enormous talent who will bring another perspective to government. I think it's an inspired move by Rishi.
Is it a bit strange, though, that a month ago the Prime Minister says 30 years of political failure, and he goes for the guy who was responsible for a fifth of those 30 years of failure?
People will remember all the positives of David's time as Prime Minister, of which there were a great many, just as there are a great many positives with what Rishi's up to now. And he's looking for the long term. I think it's a great move having David back in.
Labour was scathing.
I think it's shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. I'm not sure it's going to make much of a difference. I have to say that I was surprised that we've got back to the beginning, really, after all these years. The 7th Foreign Secretary in 7 years, an unelected Prime Minister appointing an unelected Foreign Secretary. And there's no consistency in 5 weeks ago claiming you're the change candidate from 30 years of failure, which include all the 4 previous Conservative Prime Ministers that you've replaced in an unelected manner, and then suddenly bringing one of them back. I mean, why not Liz Truss? Why not Boris Johnson? It's a pantomime.
The ex and the current, the Remainer and the Brexiteer, now coming together. A gamble to revive their party's fortunes as the election approaches.
And Nick, are there problems looming on the right of the party?
Well, Kirsty, there is deep unease on the right of the party. So what they see is no room at the inn for Suella Braverman, who has iconic status amongst Brexiteers, because she's one of the Spartans. That's just under 30 Conservative MPs who voted against Theresa May's Brexit deal at every single vote. But there is room at the inn for David Cameron, who, of course, famously and unsuccessfully led the Remain campaign. Now, Downing Street obviously lost patience with Suella Braverman after she accused the police of bias in an article that was not fully authorised by Downing Street. But interestingly, tonight, the one minister who publicly criticised her was sacked from the government. Paul Scully was Minister for London until tonight, and this is what he told me last week.
Well, I think I'd just say to every minister and every political leader, we've got to just use our language carefully, and we've got to make sure that we concentrate on dampening things down rather than fueling that sort of hatred and that division.
And now the focus is obviously on the right. So Andrea Jenkyns, very strong Brexiteer, she's written one of those letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister. But I do have to say the right is divided. So there are very strong Suella Braverman supporters who are saying the Prime Minister is going to regret this, but there are others on the right who are saying that Suella Braverman lost it with them when she said that living in a tent as a homeless person was a lifestyle choice. I understand there's one pretty significant figure on the right who on one of these WhatsApp groups says, Suella Braverman, that was the end of it for me. And talking to other people, you're saying that was the moment when Suella Braverman really destroyed her credibility.
Nick, thanks very much. Well, with me now is Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg, the former Business Secretary and also a former Leader of the House of Commons under Boris Johnson. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much for joining us. This move is all about what Rishi Sunak must think is the best way to win the election. Do you think he's right?
Well, the King's speech may have been that as well, and that's banning pedicabs.
So you don't think this is the best way to win the election?
No, I don't think it is, because Nick makes some very fair points about Suella's choice of language, which isn't always supported across the party. But in the public mind, she was in favour of controlling migration and of being tough on crime and dealing with marches that were intimidating people. The Prime Minister has now put himself on the side of not controlling migration and not being tough on crime. For a Conservative Prime Minister, that's not a good position to be in.
You, in an article for tomorrow, you've called him to effete, to worry about the things voters worried about. What do you mean, effete's such a strange adjective?
The reason I say that is because I think there is too much concern over Suella's precise choice of words, that it's too refined, it's too sensitive, that she's used words that people may have been annoyed by.
Offended by.
But what matters is, was she actually on the right side of the major policy arguments? And I think politicians need to be thick-skinned about choice of language.
But what does how Suella Braverman's sacking mean for the government tackling immigration? Because if you are saying that Rishi Sunak's out of touch with the mood on immigration, what does it mean for immigration?
It means that we are not going to be tackling legal migration thoroughly, which Suella was particularly concerned about, and was 606,000 last year.
But it's dropping.
Legal migration. Well, we're getting the figures on the 23rd of November, so we'll have to wait and see what the legal migration figures are. Illegal migration, the small boats problem, has fallen a little, and there will be the judgment on Wednesday. But I am concerned that without Suella, whichever way the judgment goes, we will still be bound by the Article 39 direction of the European Court, which she wanted to overturn and has the legal power to do. Now, James cleverly has said that he is not in favour of resigning from the European Convention on Human Rights. So I think there is distinct watering down on the migration policy.
On the James Cleverly point, absolutely he's committed to ECHR. Does that mean there's a problem with him carrying out the job of Home Secretary?
Well, he's been appointed by the Home Secretary with the confidence of the Prime Minister, and policy on the ECHR has not yet moved to the state of withdrawing from it, but the Act Parliament passed earlier this year provides for the Home Secretary to override Article 39. Now, if you're in favour of being in the ECHR, I would have thought you were unlikely to challenge the court, whereas Suella would have been willing to do so.
Well, let's look at Andrea Jenkyns' letter of no confidence. Enough is enough. Time for Rishi Sunak to go and replace him with a real Conservative Party leader. Do you understand how she could have come to that conclusion?
I don't agree with her. I think that enough is enough in terms of the number of Tory leaders in one parliament. That I think it's really difficult.
You have to stick with what you've got, whether you like it or not.
I thought that with Boris. I mean, I think I probably came on here to say, I did come on here to say so. You questioned me about it, and I think we have had a developing idea in the Constitution that the mandate is more personal than parliamentary, and I think continually changing leader has been a mistake for the Conservative Party.
Let me just ask you about David Cameron for a moment. You know, you're now in a situation where you have essentially an unelected Prime Minister and an unelected Foreign Secretary who's not responsible for answering questions in the Commons. Is that right for the Conservative Party?
It's constitutionally proper. The government speaks with one voice, and therefore any minister, however junior, answering questions in the Commons answers for the government, not as an individual. So I don't think that the House of Commons can't hold the government to account on foreign policy. It can. I actually think David Cameron is an extremely able man, and a benefit to the government in many ways. The question really is, on Suella rather than on David Cameron. It's about the trend of policy. I don't think
the trend of policy then? Do you think that Rishi Sunak is in danger? I know you're not in favour of joining a Reform Party or anything like that, but do you think he's in danger of splitting the Tory party?
No, I think we're in danger of losing votes to the Reform Party. I saw Richard Tice earlier on this evening on GB News, and he is as happy as can be. I mean, he really is. The champagne will be flowing in the Reform Party's headquarters tonight after what's been done today.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much for joining us. Listening to that, the Tory MP, Richard Graham. Richard Graham, you heard Jacob Rees-Mogg talk in terms of Suella Braverman perhaps using, as I would put it, muscular language. But do you think her language was unhelpful to the cohesion in our communities? As you said, you put that in a tweet.
Well, I do. That's why I said it. I think the combination of saying things about homeless people and tents and talking about hate marchers was exactly the opposite of what the real situation is. And so in both cases, that wasn't language that I could live with comfortably. So that's why I'm afraid, very unusually, and probably for the first time in 14 years, I criticised a cabinet minister publicly.
So is this government better off without Suella Braverman in it?
Well, she's got lots of abilities and I admire her personal story. But I do think in terms of having a Home Secretary who is calm and measured, able to work closely with the police, deal with all the issues that a Home Secretary has to, I think we will be well served by James Cleverly. And I think that's the key point.
Well, but the reason I ask is you ended up in an argument with your colleagues, and I wondered if this reshuffle is not going to bridge that divide. You had a number of colleagues on a WhatsApp group that clearly were not for what you were saying. So are we in a situation where looking at a Conservative party and indeed a party of government more divided?
I don't think so, Kirsty, because the number of people on that WhatsApp group who criticised me were actually very few. I mean, talking 4 or 5. We're talking much larger numbers of people who quietly agreed with me and who will be very relieved that we won't now have a polarisation of different views coming from the Home Secretary.
Rishi Sunak said at the party conference so clearly, this is time for change. But it's fair to say that I don't think this is what he had in mind. It's a much posher cabinet. In a sense, that might be a backward step. You've got both an unelected PM, an unelected Foreign Secretary. You've got no women in your senior 5 jobs. Was that really the change the Conservative Party needs?
My personal feeling on that is that most of my voters want to see the jobs well done. They want to see a calm, orderly government that's focused on solving problems that they have in their daily lives. So they don't really want
change, really?
No. The change is all about looking at various sort of sacred cow issues like HS2 and saying, actually, when you look at this closely, this doesn't make the best sense in terms of delivering transport solutions for the north of England.
Yeah, but David Cameron, the new Foreign Secretary, did. It's a massive project and a massive part of this government's programme. He's already at odds with others in the party.
No, I don't think that's true. David Cameron is coming in as Foreign Secretary. That's where he will be able to use his great experience.
Was he, as a Foreign Secretary, was he hugely successful?
David Cameron, he hasn't been Foreign Secretary before.
In his position
the point
in foreign
is,
policy.
I mean, I've travelled with him abroad when he was Prime Minister. I met heads of state and heads of government with him. He is extremely impressive. He knows a lot of them. He's dealt with many of these issues before. So he will be able to slot into that role, get up to speed very fast, and I'm sure will make a massive contribution.
Is there not an element of you thinks, my goodness, there's 350 Conservative MPs and not a one there who would make a Foreign Secretary. We've got to pull David Cameron back in.
No, I don't look at it like that at all. I think there are lots of people who might make perfectly reasonable Foreign Secretaries, but David Cameron brings something special to the party in the same way that William Hague did when he became Foreign Secretary for David Cameron. And I think, using that experience, that depth of knowledge is incredibly valuable.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, the reactions to David Cameron's return to government 7 years after he left Downing Street as a result of his failed gamble on Brexit have been many and various. The former Tory leader, William Hague, we've just been talking about him, writes glowingly in the Times tomorrow, Cameron's renewed prominence is a reminder that the cabinet in which he will be sitting is mainstream and centre-right. Whereas the veteran political columnist Simon Jenkins is of the opinion in The Guardian that if the answer to your problem is David Cameron, then you know you're in deep trouble. Critics point to the Greensill scandal covered by BBC Panorama 2 years ago, revealing internal documents suggesting David Cameron made more than £8 million jetting around the world to promote a highly controversial financial business, Greensill Capital. Here's Joe.
Thanks, Kirsty. It was a dawn raid at Downing Street, with this arrival provoking a raft of double takes. So why is a Prime Minister who says he wants to change the record reaching for the party's back catalogue? Now that's what I call 2016. Number 10 says Rishi Sunak values Lord Cameron's experience. He has established relationships with world leaders like Presidents Biden, Xi and Putin. He was the PM who set up the National Security Council and launched Operation Orbital, which after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 trained 22,000 Ukrainian military personnel. Now, David Cameron's instincts are arguably liberal interventionist. He oversaw British military involvement in Libya in 2011, although that attempt at regime change ended with something approaching anarchy. And remember this, in 2013.
The ayes to the right, 272. The noes to the left, 285. Yeah!
Failure to get common support for intervention in Syria after a reported chemical weapons attack. Now, a very different part of the Middle East is at the top of the new Foreign Secretary's in tray, but is the UK's current position sustainable?
He will realise that as this Israeli ground operation goes on, there will be more Palestinian civilian casualties, and it will get harder and harder to maintain public international support for what is happening. And it may mean some tough private messages to the Israeli government. Second will be Ukraine, where the Ukrainian counteroffensive hasn't achieved what we might have hoped. And I think fighting will now die down as the Ukrainian winter sets in. But the big question here is whether the Americans will continue to give current levels of military assistance to Ukraine, given the growing public opposition to it in America.
Lord Cameron's biggest political baggage is surely Brexit. The leader of Remain must now fly the flag for post-Brexit Britain across the world. Another change is China. David Cameron was instrumental to the supposed golden age of relations. Pictures like this are well and truly a thing of the past, but as recently as last month, he was lobbying in favour of a China-funded Sri Lankan port, to the frustration of China hawks on the Tory benches. Even more controversial is David Cameron's work for this man, Lex Greensill, which led to the biggest lobbying scandal ever to involve a former PM. Number 10 say the Foreign Secretary has completed ethics checks for both the House of Lords and Ministerial Office. The last former PM to return to Cabinet was Alec Douglas-Home. That was during Ted Heath's government in the 1970s, and Lord Carrington was the last peer to be Foreign Secretary. He resigned over the start of the Falklands War. There are more recent precedents. Peter Mandelson and Andrew Adonis under Gordon Brown and Nicky Morgan here under Boris Johnson have all run government departments. But if he's not in the Commons, how will MPs be able to hold him to account?
There will be other mechanisms for scrutiny. So David Cameron, as Foreign Secretary, will be able to answer questions from the House of Lords Select Committees. He can also answer questions from the House of Commons Select Committees, and you would expect in practical terms he would be very keen to do that. He will also be supported in his role by other ministers in the Foreign Office, most of whom will be in the House of Commons, and they will be able to pick up some of the parliamentary functions that he would otherwise be exercising. So there will be scrutiny of the Foreign Secretary, even though he's in the House of Lords, but it will look very different from perhaps what we're used to.
The commoner Prime Minister is now Lord Foreign Secretary. George Osborne has dubbed it the return of the King. It is the third act few voters had expected, and as one Snap poll tonight suggests, few wanted.
Joe, they will join me now in the studio is the former Minister for Culture under David Cameron, Lord Vasey, Lucy Fisher, Whitehall editor of the Financial Times, and Christian Calgary, senior political correspondent at the Daily Telegraph, at the Daily Express. Lovely to have you all here. Lucy Fisher, first of all, David Cameron's appointment, is it a stroke of genius or a retrograde step?
Well, look, it's certainly a marmalade dropper. It sucked up all the oxygen today, which you would assume was part of the strategy. We're not talking, as your first question tonight, Kirsty, about Suella Braverman, which is good news for Downing Street. Look, I've spoken to a number of senior diplomats from allied nations today who said they were surprised by his return, but they view him as credible, someone who will have access on the world stage. From a domestic perspective, you can see that he may be reassuring to Tory swing voters across the blue wall who are at risk potentially of flight to the Lib Dems. However, lots of question marks come up and doubts cast on his appointment as Foreign Secretary. Firstly, the idea that he'll be doing it from the Lords rather than answering to elected representatives. Secondly,
although we're saying it can be questions.
Well, he can, but he can't not at the dispatch box, so it's fairly limited. I think also huge question marks about his activities since leaving office, the lobbying, particularly the Greensill lobbying scandal, and then his own foreign policy that he presided over, the golden era with China. The renegotiation with Europe that ultimately ended in Brexit. He's now inheriting a foreign policy that he will have to prosecute that is markedly different from the one that he pursued when in office.
Well, Ed Vaizey, I mean, you know him well. It's a big risk, though, isn't it? Because Greensill is still fresh in people's minds.
I think there is an element of risk here. I mean, I don't know kind of what the thinking was behind bringing David Cameron back into government. I know that David Cameron would have loved the chance to serve as Foreign Secretary, which is why he accepted. I think we know the arguments. It's taken Suella Braverman, as it were, off the front pages as part of that reshuffle. It's added a sort of statesman-like air, if you like, to the cabinet, if I can put it that way. When you think about it, Rishi Sunak only became an MP in 2015. His cabinet is not actually full of experienced people who have served at length in government. And I think, funnily enough, there will be a role for David Cameron behind the scenes as a kind of mentor for Rishi Sunak. He's not going to threaten his position. He's not a leadership rival, but also it's an important signal in terms of the direction of the party, and that's exactly what's being debated and will be debated over the next few days. This kind of showdown between the right of the party, the Suellerites, and the centre of the party, the Cameroons, or however you want to characterise them.
Well, we'll come on to that divide in a minute, but just picking up with you, Christian, on the point of will it come back to haunt Rishi Sunak? The scrutiny committee after Greensill said that there was a significant lack of judgment. I mean, papers will be digging that up day after day.
I mean, it's an attractive headline to bring in a former Prime Minister, but he has one of the worst public opinion ratings of anyone, possibly even worse than Tony Blair. And as well as his questionable behaviour since leaving office, his foreign policy record is also quite a litany of bad failures. So you think you've got China, you've got Europe, you've got Libya, you've got Syria, you've got Iran, you've got calling Gaza a prison camp in 2010, which is incredibly awkward given the current conflict in Israel. So it's a really odd decision.
Well, let's talk now, because I was just talking there about the party. Is it a party of the centre? Is it a party of the right? What is it now? Do you think there is more danger of the party splitting?
I don't think the party will split, because that's, this is a question that's always been around in British politics, especially when UKIP were on the rise in the early 2010s, and it didn't happen. I think the key point today is that the right have lost control. The red wall has been cast aside as a collateral damage at the next election, and the Tories are now focusing on winning the blue wall. And David Cameron, for each vote he wins in those Lib Dem facing seats, is going to be losing them in the north.
Do you take that analysis, Lucy Fisher, that the danger is the red wall is being ignored now?
I think for me the bigger problem is the way that Sunak just seems to be thrashing around for a strategy. We've had reset after reset after reset.
We're going to have change, he said.
Well, exactly. Just 6 weeks ago, as his keynote speech at the Tory party conference, he, as Labour immediately seized upon, framed David Cameron as part of the failed status quo. So to bring him back as this, sensational comeback kid to his cabinet, I think just suggests that the ship is listing slightly.
There is definitely a lot of hopping around, which is just bizarre, and it's very, very frustrating.
Flailing.
I'm a big fan of Rishi Sunak. I think he's a details man and a technocrat, but he has lacked this political vision, and I hope to a certain extent that David Cameron coming into his cabinet, and I think seeing him quite a lot, that will kind of stabilise things and give him a vision. Now, I do think it is important, this kind of blue wall, red wall debate. I mean, obviously, you know what tribe I'm from, so my text messages all today were about people saying, I can come back to the Conservatives now. I really thought they were going off the reservation. I was really worried I was going to sit on my hands, maybe not vote. I think that was a significant problem that people didn't necessarily detect.
But for every one of the ones that's taking that view is what
that is the political calculation.
And that is the political calculation. Plus, we haven't even talked about what Suella will be doing in the backbenches.
Yes, I mean, the Suella on the backbenches, I think, is a problem for another day, right? There's a long time between now and the next Tory leadership election. Anything could happen. Yeah. But on the red wall, blue wall issue, I mean, I had blue wall MPs saying that Cameron is good but not enough because voters already know what this government's like. They've spent a year talking about small boats and culture war issues, and that's already turned them off. And then on the other hand, red wall MPs who, you know, they're not about putting leadership letters into the 22 committee like Andrea Jenkins, but they were really upset, actually. It wasn't anger, it was upset, because this is Rishi Sunak essentially telling a large part of his party they no longer politically matter.
Well, I think we haven't heard the end of it from the right, though. I think
it's just Andrea Jenkins so far, but you think there'll be more letters?
Yeah, well, not necessarily letters. There could be letters, but I think, you know, I've heard mutterings today of the right have a grid. You know, they have plans for the rest of this week. I think we are going to see a test of the numbers that Suella Braverman has, you know, how much support she can command. We know that there are those in the Common Sense group, led by John Hayes, the New Conservatives, the newer grouping of 2019ers on the right. I think they are going to come out and try and make some noise, and particularly, of course, on Wednesday, if the government, its key flagship Rwanda deportation policy is found to be unlawful by the Supreme Court.
But why would Suella Braverman come out now? You're right, she'd stay in the backbench quietly just now. Just let's see how it all plays out.
Well, partly it wasn't her decision. I think we all thought she wanted to resign over something. I don't think or be resigned. And I don't think it was this. I think the reason Rishi Sunak did it today, rather than waiting until the judgment, was to cut out that possibility of her quitting on her own terms.
And you talk about, in fact, I think you did mention the word technocrat. The danger is, isn't it, in all this, we're a very television medium, we're in the year before an election campaign, at least. We've got a technocrat in Rishi Sunak, but then you have got, as you say, you know, your friend David Cameron comes in. He's much a more gifted communicator. Yeah. He's more relaxed in his skin. Yeah. It's inevitable that he is going to come much more to the fore than you might be thinking today.
I don't think it is. I mean, I don't think that. I think David Cameron is grateful for the chance to be the Foreign Secretary. You know, you shouldn't underestimate how frustrating it must have been for him to be out of power. I haven't spoken to him about this, but this is what I assume. And I don't think he's going to try and... I think he's clever enough not to take any kind of shine away from, spotlight away from Rishi Sunak. But what I do think is I think he will get stuck in. I mean, I think you will see... This is kind of may sound a bit banal, but I think you'll see David Cameron at constituency dinners, for example, for MPs with marginal seats. I think you'll see him reaching out to people like John Hayes, with whom he has actually a very good personal relationship. I think the right will... You're laughing at me. I think the right will look small.
To a leadership
I think the right, if they kind of play the rebels, will actually look quite small, if because Rishi Sunak is trying to put in place a cabinet to set a path to the next election.
But you said yourself, you know, this is in a sense, you know, he's been flailing. You didn't put it flailing. I perhaps said flailing. But is this, in terms of timing, Lucy, the last roll of the dice in terms of how this pre-election cabinet and senior ministers is going to look?
I think so. The last piece of the jigsaw, I think, that could change, and there's been so much fevered speculation, has been around the chancellorship. We know that, you know, we're less than 10 days out from the autumn statement, so no one, I think, was expecting Jeremy Hunt to be moved today. There'd been lots of briefing from Downing Street sources in the past few weeks about the fact he was safe until the budget. Let's see what happens then, you know. I wouldn't be surprised, almost particularly if it looks like Sunak and the Conservatives are headed for a spell in opposition. It might give him some sort of grim satisfaction to beat Labour to the post in appointing the first female Chancellor in Claire Coutinho and stopping Rachel Reeves claiming that mantle.
How does that scenario look to you?
Well, I think there will be a change, which is just ridiculous, because then that'll be what Rishi's fifth reshuffle. You lose count. Rishi Sunak has consistently proved himself to be a really poor sort of person with political instincts. Yeah. They've been all over the place. He doesn't know what he believes in.
He makes
odd decisions, time-wise, tone-wise. And he needs to fix it. And, you know, if anything comes out of today, I really hope David Cameron fixes that for Rishi.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're right out of time. Thank you very much indeed. The situation in the Middle East has shifted the focus from Ukraine. As the country prepares for the winter, Russia is continuing its offensive in Donbass. For over a month now, Ukraine has been defending itself against repeated Russian attacks in the town of Avdiivka, which Russia has been attempting to encircle. unsuccessfully for now. This morning, according to local authorities, Avdiivka came under renewed Russian bombardment. Against all odds, the town retains its reputation as a stronghold just beyond occupied Donetsk. But some fear that it will soon follow the same fate as Bakhmut. Jack Losh, whose report from Avdiivka we showed in the spring, has been speaking to some of the locals he met back then to see how they're doing now and what this winter could bring for the Ukrainian eastern flank.
With global attention turned to the Middle East, Russia has launched a new ground offensive in eastern Ukraine. This couple have endured almost 2 years of full-scale fighting. But this new assault is the final straw. They're leaving. Others are less keen to go.
Потому что здесь стреляют, потом вас вывести может и не будет возможности, поняли?
А что я ж там буду делать?
Жить спокойной жизнью.
Там свет есть, вода, все есть.
Бабушка.
Нет.
А что ты будешь делать? Ни воды достать, ни хлеба, ни фига.
Ничего.
Hennady Yudin is a policeman. His job now, evacuating civilians.
Вдалося переконати, це зайняло у нас більше 1,5 години, мабуть. Під обстрілами і обмовляли. Буквально за 100-200 метрів у нас зривались ворожі снаряди.
These evacuations are taking place around Avdiivka, an industrial hub that has become a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. 6 months ago, Newsnight reported from inside this bombed-out Ukrainian town, travelling in with Igor, a local man, as he ran in aid supplies for the civilian population.
Зараз їдемо по дорозі, яка є єдиною артерією сполучення.
It was early summer. Ukraine's counter-offensive was imminent. Hopes were high.
Ми ж все робимо заради перемоги. Хтось там доставляє хліб, хтось возить щось. В принципі, ми протидіємо.
Чим ближче додому, тим нам тепліше одягатися.
6 months on, that picture is very different. A stalling Ukrainian campaign, the world's gaze turned to the Middle East, and a new Russian assault aimed at finally encircling Avdiivka, a defensive stronghold and gateway to the occupied east. Igor's had a ringside seat.
Виїхали ми там щось близько, може, 3-ї в Авдіївку.
This Russian kamikaze drone had him in its sights, and that's Igor's van down below.
Метрів 400-500, може, десь там плюс-мінус до лінії розмежування. Ну, їхали, спускались. З правої сторони вікна, там, лобового, така була спалах жорсткий такий, хлопок. Отак потрогали себе, там, трохи, ну, все вроде норм. Ну, и максимально быстро удалялись с места.
Слушай, ну, я думаю, вряд ли это снаряд. Какую его, что это? Может, гранату кто-то кидал? Такую гранату? А, типа сверху?
Так быстро я еще по старой части города не ездил никогда.
Сука, хуй я больше хлеб я не повезу, честно, блядь. Ебал, дремал.
The attack on Igor last month came as Moscow launched its new offensive against Avdiivka. Russian tanks and waves of troops were deployed to surround the town. Airstrikes and artillery pounded already devastated residential areas where some 1,500 civilians still remain. Hennady, the policeman's seen it all.
Це мій рідне місто Авдіївка. Я там народився, виріс і кожного дня, в'їжджаючи в місто, бачу нові руйнування, це боляче. Будинок, де я виріс, де мешкали мої батьки, повністю зруйнований.
So far, the Ukrainians have repelled these assaults, inflicting huge losses on Russia's soldiers. Almost 7,000 killed or wounded, claims Ukraine's military. Whatever the figure, and that one is unverified, the UK's Ministry of Defence says these are among Russia's biggest casualty rates of the war.
The Russians only managed to advance on the north flank a little bit above 1.5 kilometers, and at a tremendous expense of man-powered vehicles. I suspect that the Ukrainians will be able to hold out and continue to bleed Russian forces.
Moscow's campaign to capture Avdiivka may be less about battlefield strategy and more about securing a propaganda prize back in Russia. Russia's forces have been on Avdiivka's doorstep for almost a decade, since first taking over nearby territory in 2014. Since then, Ukraine's long-standing fortifications have, so far, held back a total Russian breakthrough. But a new wave of ground assaults appears imminent, with reports of 40,000 Russian soldiers massed on 3 sides of the town. And this threatens to turn Avdiivka into another Bakhmut, that nearby city turned battleground, bombarded into oblivion.
Авдіївка сьогодні це десятки обстрілів міста.
More battle-hardened soldier than bureaucrat, this is the town's mayor, Vitaly Barabash.
Просто ці авіабомбові удари, вони будинки складають, просто як карткові будинки.
To break the deadlock, Barabash is among many who want more firepower from the West.
Це F-16, вони потрібні. Треба більше, не знаю, систем HIMARS.
Until then, Ukrainians like Igor will continue to feel the brunt of Russia's onslaught.
Слушай, они как бы утомили вот этими своими бомбами.
Якщо так буде ще там багато тижнів там або на пару місяців, то там в принципі навіть фундаментів не залишиться.
Meanwhile, emergency workers like Gennady deal with their own private tragedies. Last year, his young daughter passed away.
З моєю жінкою, з мамою, і вони лягли спати, і ранку вони не проснулися. Мене більше стала мотивувати моя робота. Я все можливе роблю для цього, щоб і вивести людей, і спасти дітей з міста і з цього жаху.
That horror shows no sign of abating. And with the world focused on the Middle East, the question now is, how long can Ukraine hold the line? And how long can it depend on the West?
That by Josh Locke. That's all from us tonight. I'm back tomorrow. Until then, sleep well. Goodbye.